Well, good evening, everyone. I'm David Wallace. I'm Vice President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the Society this evening. Now, this is the 12th annual Peter Wilson Lecture, and lecturers have been key figures, and are indeed key figures, in the scientific world. Previous lecturers have included John Beddington, the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Cabinet Office, Professor Ian Wilmot, of Dolly the Sheep fame, Steve Jones, well known in biological sciences, and Sir John now Lord Krebs. And the lecture is named after the late Professor Peter Wilson, CBE Fellow of this Society. He's a former Professor of Agriculture and Rural Economy at the University of Edinburgh. Peter had a pivotal role in the emergence of Edinburgh Consortium for Rural Research, and that's now the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research. An extraordinarily distinguished career, became the General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, gained its bicentenary medal, very rare honour for someone who's given, awarded for someone who's given so much to the Society. I'm really delighted that his widow Maud is here with us, and grandson Stephen. Could I say that on a personal level, that I knew Peter. I was a professor at the University of Edinburgh from 79 to 93, and I knew Peter. He was a most congenial, supportive, thoughtful colleague. And this is not something that I would say about everyone with whom I worked on the Dean's Committee of the University of Edinburgh at the time. The final one from me is just to thank the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research and the Society of Biology in Scotland for their partnership in this event. So without more ado, could I invite Professor Burt, please, to come to the stage to chair the lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, David, for those good words. So I don't want to say too much, but tonight we're very pleased to welcome Professor Tim Benton, who's going to talk about feed in the future. And he's going to raise lots of questions. And at the very end of his talk, we're going to have a 20-minute session. So hopefully you can save all these questions up, and we can have quite a good time answering them. So the big question is, can we feed the world sustainably? So it's up to you, Tim, to tell us how we can do this, hopefully.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honour to be here, and thank you for the invitation, everybody. I slightly feel I have bitten off more than I can chew in terms of this topic is enormous. And my excuse is I can't see the clock very well. So Dave, please shout at me when you think I've gone on for too long. Food. Food, it's something that's close to all of our hearts, obviously. It's something that we need on a minute-by-minute basis if you're my wife, or on a day-by-day basis if you're somebody who is more suffering. And clearly food matters in many ways, and it's not just about agriculture. So let's see if I can work out the technology. There are about 805, this is the latest estimate, million people who have insufficient food on a daily basis, and so therefore are permanently hungry. And in a world of plenty, which is effectively what we live in, this in itself is a crying shame. So clearly food and the amount of food in the world is important from international development. Food is also important because it determines a whole range of things to do with the way society works. This is food price over time from 2004 to 2012. And where there is a red vertical line, that is where there has been some degree of civil unrest in a particular country. And you don't have to be a statistician to see that where the price goes up quickly, you have a lot of civil unrest. And actually, it's one of the determining things that sparked the Arab Spring, was the rise in food prices that was very rapid. It's one of the most potent ways of getting people on the streets. Food and availability of food and all the rest of that contributes to patterns of human migration. And clearly, as we know from the election, at the moment, there is a certain amount of interest in immigration into Europe and across Europe and into the UK. In the UK, close to 1 million people, almost exactly 1 million people last year received food handouts. So food poverty is very much a reality of where we're living. And I've spent the weekend in Edinburgh and I've been struck by the number of poor people literally sitting overnight in their sleeping bags, requiring access to food, water, drink and all the other things that go on. But we live in a society that's very unequal. For many people, this is a good meal. And of course, this sort of eating contributes to this sort of thing. And now, actually, food-related consumption patterns is the number one mortality factor in the world. And eating too much of the wrong sorts of things is a major driver of ill health on a global basis. And, as it says on the bottom, Agri-Food is the world's biggest land user, the world's biggest employer, the world's biggest polluter, and so many things intersect with food. That politically, of course, is important. And I wear two hats. One is a part-time academic at the University of Leeds, and the other one is I coordinate this thing called the Global Food Security Programme across governments in the UK and the public funders of research in the area of food and its impacts and its future. And this includes the Scottish Government, so I pop up and down to ScotGov fairly frequently. And the reason we have to do a job is because food doesn't naturally sit in any one government department or any one research funder. So DEFRA, our Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, owns part of it. Food Standards Agency owns another part of it. Department of Health owns another part of it. Business Innovation and Skills owns the business part of it. And actually, what that has led to is an extremely fractured environment in which government thinks about food. So my role, in a sense, is to help do some of the thinking about the challenges of food, and I'm very much, and the GFS programme is very much a legacy of John Beddington, and to take some of the messages through into our stakeholder communities. So, food. Why is it a worry? Now, many of these things you will know, and what I'm going to try and do is just put a lot of these bits of the jigsaw together. Well, first of all, at the moment there are 7 billion or so people, and in 2050 there'll be a third more people on the planet. So all things being equal, we need to find a third more food. Many of those people will be in areas of the world which actually at the moment are struggling to produce enough food. The second thing is that this is a lovely graph from a recent paper. This is the amount of calories that people demand, including the calories that they demand that are grown and then fed to livestock to produce meat. And this is income on a global basis. And what you can see both on a macro level and on an individual country level or economic group level is that as you get richer, you demand more and more and more. And a lot of this is driven by consumption of meat. Richer people eat more meat. Some of it is driven by urbanization, that the faster we live our lives, the more we live in cities, the more we get dislocated from where food is produced, the more we buy things in a shop, shove it in the fridge, find it a few days later when it's gone slimy and throw it out. So there is a relationship between urbanization and waste and consumption. Whole range of interesting drivers there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So more people, more mouths, more demand. Next thing why we should worry about food is that the world is globalized. And to illustrate this is a slide that I'm so sick to death of, but every time I take it out of my talk, somebody says, put it back in. Because most of us think about food, a lamb chop or a root vegetable that is grown locally, and it's easy to articulate. But here is a Kit Kat, a UK Kit Kat. It has sugar from the Caribbean, cocoa from West Africa, milk and butter that come from the UK, but whey, milk protein, comes from New Zealand. It has palm oil from Indonesia, soy from Latin America. It has wheat from within 35 miles of the factory because they like to source locally. They told me that without a hint of irony. It has yeast, which comes from a factory in India. It has salt that came from China, and plaster of Paris, which glues the wafers together and gives it a bit of snap, comes from a factory in India. That is what most people eat most of the time. If you go into a supermarket and buy something, it will almost certainly have soy, palm oil in, and sugar or salt, depending on whether it's sweet or savoury. So, of course, the logistics of getting this food around the world is also a worry. So this is not a map, this is just where container ships ply across the ocean bringing our food, and you can see. It kind of outlines the shape of the coast very well. But there are a lot of these places where a lot of traffic goes, where there is some degree of worry that if something were to happen, then things will change. So, for example, were the Middle East to explode, from a geopolitical perspective, which is not unreasonable given some of the things that are going on there, this whole transport route would then shut down. And one of the things that I do is I intersect with a whole lot of very intelligent people in Westminster, and many people in the civil service are frighteningly intelligent, but incredibly stupid at the same time. I showed this to somebody from the Foreign Office, and he said, well, if that gets blocked, that's easy, you just take all the ships round. And I said, well, that's twice the distance. It'll take twice the time. And he said, so? Well, that's the equivalent of halving the fleet. So what do you do in those sorts of circumstances? In the UK, we're slightly worried that with climate change and sea level rises, our east coast ports will overtop in a storm surge. And we have 3 or 5 days' worth of food in the country. And if we can't get the food into the country because we've lost the port infrastructure, what then happens? The globalization of the world creates other issues. This is a map, a statistical map, but it's a map nonetheless. Where points are a long way apart, they're dissimilar. Where points are close together, they're similar. Each point is an average of, in statistical space, a country's diet. And what you can see is that in the 60s, the red points, the global space of the world's diet was a big circle, and in the last 5 years or so, the global space of the world's diet is a small circle. What that means, in simple terms, is that everybody's diet around the world has changed, but everybody's diet has become more similar. Wherever you go in the world, you can get pizza, or Indian, or Chinese, or McDonald's, or whatever. We all eat more or less the same thing. And the consequence of that is that we have the need to produce huge amounts of relatively few things. Nearly 2/3 of the world's calories come from just 3 crops. That is a risk. Were something to happen to a particular crop, then we could lose a whole chunk of what we need, in inverted commas. So, for example, there is a new disease, stem rust of wheat, UG99, which appeared here in 1999, in Uganda in 1999, and it's marching around the world. If it gets to the major production areas, then things could get difficult. The third reason to worry about food is the world is changing. We know the world is changing. These are just some pictures from the last few seasons that we've had. We've had drought, we've had heat waves, we've had severe storms in winter, we've had wet summers, we've had very cold winters, killing a lot of our hill sheep. If you just look at the pattern of our last few seasons, the last 5 years of seasons, every one of them has been extreme in some way. And I've taught statistics all my life, and most people know simple probability. If you're rolling a dice and you want a 6, there's a 1 in 6 chance of doing it. If you're rolling 2 dice because you're playing Monopoly and you want 2 6s, there's a 1 in 6 times a 1 in 6, a 1 in 36 chance of getting two 6s. The chance of getting a sequence of 10 seasons or so, each one extreme, 1 in 10 years, 1 in 50 years, 1 in 100 years, 1 in 200 years, the chance of getting the sequence of weather that we've had is something like 1 in 3 billion years. The world is clearly changing. We have not just been unlucky, we have been so phenomenally unlucky that the simplest explanation is that climate change is real. So we're on course for a world which will be 4 degrees hotter by the end of the century. Now that doesn't sound too bad. We can wear more t-shirts in the summer, maybe the midges will go away if we're lucky. But 4 degrees is an average, day and night, across the world. This is a map from the Met Office, what the world might look like with a 4-degree world. The sea is cooler, so actually the land is going to be hotter than 4 degrees. This is UK Central England temperature, so this is a map of a graph of our temperatures. You can see that there is quite an upward trajectory. That's our average temperature for the year, is 10 degrees. If you add 4 degrees on top of that, then that doesn't sound very much, but it is such a big chunk. And one of the reasons why it's so important is that actually the things that determine how we respond to the weather are the extremes, and this is temperature. Our extreme temperatures, our hot temperatures, are not close to 10 degrees, obviously. They're in the 30s, 20 degrees hotter. So if you then look at somewhere in the world like the Midwest, where a lot of the maize is grown, that could go up 6 or 7 degrees, day and night, average throughout the year. And where the maximum temperature in the summer is already above 30, adding 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 degrees to that because it's a hot year, you could easily get to the point where plants just cannot grow. There isn't enough molecular biology in the world to allow plants to grow and fruit when the day and nighttime temperature gets much above 35 degrees. So you could easily see that if you take a really hot period in the middle of summer and put it on top of any agricultural system, and that hot period is hot enough, you could get very big impacts. This is some data. Just briefly, this is a distribution of the data for summer temperatures, 50s, 50 to 80s, 80s to 90s, 90s to 2000, 2001 to 2011. And what you can see is that the average temperature in this period, 50 to 80s, is normalized for 0. What you can see is this distribution is marching along rightwards. The temperatures are really changing. Some temperatures are changing. For statistics nerds, this is a normal distribution. So the probability of getting a summer temperature out here in this period was 1 in 100 or less. Now, the probability of getting a temperature out there is about 1 in 7 years. Temperatures have increased that much. So what was a 1 in 1,000-year event when I was born is now about a 1 in a 20-year event in terms of its extremity, its extremeness. And what this means is that as we go forward in time, this is a graph from the IPCC, the variability in the agricultural production in a given area is going to become more variable. The variability is going to increase. So it's not just that climate change is going to stop plants growing, where it does, that's clearly important, but in some places which are traditionally good areas for growing, climate change will stop plants growing every now and then. And so the variability of our global food system is going to become much more important than it has been beforehand. And clearly this matters in many different ways. But one of the reasons that climate change matters is because we live in a globalized world again. This is a map of where the world's calories come from. Effectively, just 5 places: corn, soya, wheat, rice, and palm oil. Those are the major crops. This is a map of where climate change is likely to reduce yields, and where it is the deeper reds, Western Australia, this is the soy belt at the top of Brazil. Where it's deeper red, yields might go down by about 50%. Where it's green, they go up. Now, if you transpose the hotspots of calorie production down below, what you can see is that most of the areas where calories come from are going to be threatened significantly by climate change. Perhaps apart from Northwest Europe. Now, you can imagine, if you're somebody sitting in Department of Business Innovations and Skills, what you see here is not a map of threats to people's livelihoods. What you see is an opportunity for export of agricultural production. Wonderful! Everywhere else in the world won't be able to grow enough food. We can grow an awful lot in Europe and export it to them, sell it to them. A business opportunity. But then there is a risk that, of course, that our balance between sustainability in our agricultural system and agricultural production might be shifted in favour of production. In fact, I have heard somebody who'd better remain nameless as you're recording this, say somebody within government say, in 20 years' time, no one will care about skylarks or any of these other things in the countryside because food will be so important. That worries me as an ecologist. The other reason, the last reason, before I get onto the next section of the talk, about why food is a worry, is clearly associated with competition for resources and some of these sustainability things. So this is a map of global agriculture. Where it's yellow is pasture land, where it's green is the arable land. And what you can see is that the world is coloured other than rainforest or desert. So the only place that we can effectively expand agriculture, other than reclaiming brownfield sites and other things, is by getting rid of rainforest or a bit of grassland in South America. So land is constrained. Water is constrained as well. At the moment, agriculture accounts for about 70% of the world's water use. And by water use, that's water taken out of rivers and wells and things like that. Industry, 20%, and domestic consumption, 10%. A kilogram of beef takes between 10 and 12 tons of water to produce, in terms of the rain water or the irrigation water that is needed to grow the food for the cow to eat, and then some of the processing and the washing and the cow drinking and so on. A green bean that you might buy from Kenya takes a gallon of water to produce. So if you buy a packet of beans from Tesco's or whatever, put them in your fridge and then throw them away when they go slimy, you've effectively taken a bath full of water from a drought-prone country, imported that water, or exported a drought, depending on which way you look at it. And personally, I think there are some issues there around the ethics of trade and how, whether or not, simply because they want money, whether or not that is a good way to treat our natural resource base. But the point is, food requires an awful lot of water, which we sometimes forget about. This is data from Tim Hess at Cranfield University, but effectively, you can see the statistics. Every day, you require 2 tons of rainwater to produce the food. Well, this is in the UK. If we stop producing food in the UK and import more, it would be more likely a bigger quantity of tap water. But when people say we have to conserve our water resources in the UK, we think about doing things like putting a brick in the cistern or putting a timer on the shower or those sorts of things. But actually, in our food, we use more water than in our domestic water consumption. Of this 160 or so litres of tap water, 108 of it comes in food that's imported. 8 out of the top 10 countries we import from into the UK are already drought prone. So we're bringing water in, embedded in our food. So food is a worry. More people want more food in the face of climate change and with increasing constraints, sorry about the spelling, on land and water. So that's the question. Can we do it, and can we do it in a way that is sustainable into the future without wrecking the environment? So I'm now going to flip through and 4 areas where I think sustainability solutions might lie. The first one is that, and it might be paradoxical to some people, sustainability of the agri-food system requires intensification. And I'll just go through the logic of that. Oh, sorry, wrong button. This is a graph over time from 1960s to now of overall demand for food. And this is the amount of land divided by the number of people on the planet. So that is the share of land that each person has to produce their resources. And as you can see, over time, the amount of land per person has fallen as population has grown. In a sense, that's not surprising at all. But what that means is that my share, and I was born just after here, so my share of agricultural land to produce the goods that I want has gone from about 1.7 hectares to about 0.7 hectares. So even if my demand hasn't changed, the land that has had to produce that demand has effectively shrunk. And that's intensification, getting more per unit area. And if you think about a person's demand from that unit area, you've got, this is apparently a year's worth of food in boxes in case there's a nuclear war. You can buy a year's worth of stored food, dried food for $800 in the US. A year's worth of food. This is apparently, I got this off the website yesterday as I was doing this talk, this is the amount of clothes that the average person recycles each year, so buys and then charity shops or jumble sales. According to our bioethanol statistics and the biofuels mandate, each person uses about 15 gallons of biofuel in petrol, if you're driving the average amount, per year. So this is what's got to come out of the shrinking area of land that is yours on a fair share basis. 0.7 of a hectare is about a football pitch. So think about food, fuel, fibre coming from that. By the middle of the century, it will be 2/3 of a football pitch. By the end of the century, it might be 1/3 of a football pitch. So to get your same amount of demand out of that, you have to get more out of each unit area. So intensification is part of the answer. And one of the worries about global agriculture is that the rate at which yields have been increasing from a unit area of land has started to decline. Now, I'm very proud of this time series. I spent literally 3 months in Stirling University Library, getting interlibrary loans about 15 years ago, putting this first together. This is a time series for Stirlingshire and its precursors and antecedents over time. The earliest data I could get was 1700. First agricultural revolution, second agricultural revolution, and now this whole graph zoomed in a bit, the yields are starting to tail off. This agricultural revolution, just as an aside, was caused by two things. One was the end of the Second World War, and all of that nitrogen that we put into ammunition then had a use in terms of being able to put into nitrogen fertilizer. And of course, huge amounts of plant breeding and the Norman Borlaug revolution that underpinned that. Where you look around the world, and these are different crops in different places, the pattern is either it's starting to tail off, or it's dipping down, or it's flat, and only in a few places is it going up. Now, whether this tailing off is climate change, or whether this is some erosion of soils, or whether it is our farmer adaptation, or any a whole number of explanations potentially, for us to carry on getting what we want out of our shrinking pieces of land per capita, this graph has to still go on going up. So there is a big role for biology. Because if we don't do that, it is unsustainable. And to illustrate that, since those yields have been tailing off, this is the amount of area of agricultural land. It's started to expand over the last decade since those crops have been tailing off. And what that means is that we're losing a land area the same size as Scotland and Wales, those international SI units, same size as Scotland. We're losing that land area every year as places like rainforests are deforested to make way for agricultural land. If we could increase the outputs per unit area, it would reduce this pressure, and things like orangutans would be safer. I had a conversation with the Minister of Trade in Indonesia a couple of years ago, and he said his duty, that's what he said, his duty was to convert rainforest into agricultural land because that's what brought in the money for the country, and they needed the money. Rainforest doesn't provide money for their income, and therefore it is nowhere near as good. So in terms of intensifying to raising output per unit area, there's a whole lot of fun things that can be done. It's not just all about new genetics. It's not all about GM. I hate it when agricultural arguments end up talking about GM as though it was the only thing that could be done. We can do much better at managing soils. We can be much better at using our existing resources. We can grow more food in cities. This is a nice blockhouse is actually LED run. If you tune the LEDs so they're different lights and you're growing something like basil, you end up with different flavours of the basil according to the light intensity. And that's something to do with the fact that the reason that basil is so fragrant is because that's an anti-insect adaptation. It's to stop them getting eaten. And the insects are apparently most prevalent that eat the basil, most prevalent in the morning and the evening, not in the heat of the day. So when there's more red light in the spectrum, they think they're more at risk. They think the plants upregulate their anti-insect chemicals, and so you get more flavoursome things. But lots of things we can do without necessarily converting land. This is an interesting little robot. It is trialled by Simon Blackmore at Harper Adams. It isn't yet available on the market, but the idea is they've got an image analysis system that allows the camera, well, the brain behind the camera, to recognise any one of 26 weeds. So the idea is that this little robot trundles around the fields by itself, looks at every plant, says, you're a weed, and then just zaps that weed rather than spraying the whole field. So lots of scope for some of those things there. So intensification is part of the answer, but I just want to stress that intensification doesn't have to be applied equally everywhere. And I think that within the European context, there's a lot of argument that actually less intensity might be a good thing. But just to illustrate this, this is a map of Africa where we've got data, and where the colours are yellows and reds means that there is a huge difference between what they produce and what they could produce. So where it's red, they are only producing, in this particular area, 10% of the yield that they could produce if they used more fertiliser or different methods of pest control or different genetics that are already available on the market. So a lot of the global food security issue is not just about new science, it is transferring the science we already have to the right places. The second challenge of sustainability, how am I doing, quarter of an hour? 20 minutes, God, doing well. The second challenge is understanding what sustainable means. Now, I've been working on sustainable agriculture for 25 years, and I still don't understand it. But we know, in a sense, that sustainability is to do with the amount that we're undermining the environment, and therefore the ability to maintain what we're doing some point into the future. And just as an illustration of this, this is data from DEFRA, and it's based on a farmer applying the standard amount of nitrogen fertiliser in their field to grow an arable crop. If they are doing this, and current wheat yields prices, they might make less cost, about £900 from that hectare of wheat. But whilst they're making £900, this is the amount of cost that they're doing to the environment, hidden cost largely, but cost nonetheless that they're doing to the environment, and it totals £330. And these are costs to air quality and therefore impacts on human health, to water quality, impacts on water quality and the amount of treatment that has to be done in water works, impacts on recreational fisheries, impacts on biodiversity, and a whole range of other things like that. Up till now, in a sense, we've got away with not really paying these costs. But as the pressures on our land system mount, we do have to pay the costs, especially around water. As everybody demands more water and our population is growing, our water resources are becoming much more important to us, so we have to make sure that they are of good quality. We can't literally flush the issues away. Sustainability, depending on who you talk to, can mean an infinite number of different things. In my lab, we did a review, which is now in press, about how people have measured and assessed sustainability. And effectively, these are all things that people have measured in terms of environmental, farming's impacts on agriculture, on the environment. These are all things. And we've summarise them into a smaller number of kind of major headings. But the issue is not that sustainability encompasses impacts on biodiversity or impacts on water or impacts on energy or impacts on greenhouse gases or impacts on soils. It encompasses all of those, or livelihoods or welfare or a whole range of other things. The real issue about sustainability is that yield is associated in a positive way with profit and some other things, but yield is associated in a negative way with a whole range of different issues. So it's not that it's complex to measure sustainability, it is how do we deal with the fact that simultaneously we want cheap food, which requires lots of production, and simultaneously we want a nice environment, but we don't actually pay for the nice environment. The trade-offs between those two things are really important. Another reason why sustainability is, in technical terms, rather difficult is that there is no such thing as a simple recipe for sustainability. I can't go into a supermarket and look at two products and say that one's more sustainable than that one. I can't go on a farm and say to a farmer, you should be doing this, this, and this, and you'll be more sustainable. I can make some generic comments, but not in detail. And just to illustrate this, this is a study we did a few years ago. This is this is biodiversity of plants against crop yield for organic and conventional farms, And this shows that effectively at low yields, organic farms have a lot more biodiversity on them. But if you get an organic farm which is high yielding, you end up with having exactly the same biodiversity on those organic farms that conventional farms. Because you're pressurising the system. Any farming system is perturbing the environment. The more you're pressurising the system to get stuff out, the more you're perturbing the environment. And it doesn't matter whether you're weeding mechanically, organically, or weeding using pesticides. At some stage, you're taking the weeds out, and weeds is biodiversity. And once you take the weeds out, you're taking the food out for the insects, and once you're taking that out, you're taking the food out for the birds, and everything kind of falls apart. So there's no simple thing. We can't just say, go and do this, and you're sustainable. The next thing around sustainable agriculture is about, are we talking about a field? Are we talking about a farm? Are we talking about a landscape? So here is a picture of an agricultural landscape. What does it do? It produces food. Yeah, that's the whole point of an agricultural landscape. But it also produces water. It provides some degree of flood protection. It supports biodiversity. This also helps agriculture. It provides recreation and amenity value for people in the countryside or visiting the countryside. It provides cultural value. The look of the landscape is hugely important for many people. It supports culturally important biodiversity. This is a skylark, which is still, I think, Classic FM's #1 in its charts, the lark ascending. It's clearly culturally important if it's our most important piece of classical music. It supplies energy, it stores carbon. So for me, the issue of sustainability is not how you define what a farmer should do in his field, it is how you get to a landscape and get all of these things still coming out of it, because all of these things matter. But from a business perspective, only food and water, and a little bit tourism, only food and water really have a market value. So we have a lot of issues to do with economic power embedded in this. I think I'll skip over this, I'm running out of steam. Sustainable land use, not just at the farm scale or the landscape scale, is further complicated, I need an education, by the fact that everything is connected in this global world by a market. So imagine we have two areas that are not part of the same place, some distance apart. Let's say the butterfly represents Amazonia and the corn represents Northwest Europe. At the moment, we produce a lot of food in Northwest Europe, and that food feeds the world, and so Amazonia is protected. But imagine we want to put the biodiversity back in Northwest Europe. we take production out of Northwest Europe to gain biodiversity and soften production. What that means is that there isn't enough food in the world at the right sort of prices. So somewhere else in the world will say, hey, there's a market opportunity, let's produce more food here. And that then might result in the Amazonia getting chopped down. So the only real way out of this connection through the marketplace, I think, is by reducing the demand for food, not by spatially shifting it around. And what I mean by that is, EU flag, until relatively recently, the EU had a goal of organic land encompassing 20% of the farmland in Europe. If we moved to a situation where we had 20% of farmland that was organic, our demand for food wouldn't go down, but our production of food would go down. So we would import more food, and we would import more food which would come from a land area about the size of Portugal, some 12 million hectares. And that land area about the size of Portugal would almost certainly be in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia. So what that would mean is that we would have a local saving of our environment here, but we would export the need to intensify elsewhere where there is perhaps more biodiversity, less environmental regulation. So we'd have a local good to our environment, and we would export and amplify an environmental cost. So sustainable agriculture in England or Scotland or Europe cannot be divorced from some of these big global issues. Sorry, I'll skip over that. Right, the last bit, which is, I think, intellectually one of the interesting bits, is that it's not just about production. The total food produced in sub-Saharan Africa is about the equivalent of what Europe and North America buys each year but throws away uneaten. Criminal. Most of us overeat, myself included, or overdrink, depending on the whiskey, by about 20% of calories needs per day. That's why the population's getting more obese. If, and it seems to be true, each one of us on average throws away about a third of the food we buy, and each one of us on average overeats by about 20%, that means 50% of the food and drink that we buy is excess to requirements. This is a land use map of the UK. Where it's green is pastureland, where it's brown is arable. If we made wise consumption and purchasing decisions, it would free up the equivalent of all the arable area in the UK. We throw away 91% of the land area of Wales in terms of production terms. And our unwise consumption and purchasing decisions are creating this huge public health issue. In the UK, the costs of overconsumption of calories especially cost each family or each household about £2,500 in health costs. This is why the NHS is politicised at the moment, because of the costs of dealing with both an ageing population and an obese population. £2,500 per household is effectively what we pay in a fat tax, if you want to call it like that. In other parts of the world, it's even worse. In China, over 50% of the adult population are on the verge of developing diabetes, have metabolic syndrome. 12% are already diabetic. In the UK, it's £1,000 per year per person as a diabetic. So this, if even only a third of this 50% develop diabetes, that would be 300 or 400 billion out of the Chinese economy. And as I said earlier, overconsumption is associated with over 20% of deaths. It's such a problem there are now more obese people in sub-Saharan Africa than there are seriously malnourished people in sub-Saharan Africa. The twin burdens of obesity and malnutrition are almost everywhere, including in the UK. So, there is a need for change. We want abundant, cheap, safe, nutritious, high welfare and sustainable food, but we can't have it all. If we want cheap food, that requires more production, cheaper production, larger scale production, lack of resilient reduction, and then that impacts upon welfare. It impacts upon nutrition because the cheapest food has the biggest commodity crop ingredients. So that's calories, effectively, calories and fat. To illustrate, if we carry on as we are, So with current yield trends in terms of the development of agricultural outputs and current demand trends, by 2050, so over the next 35 years, we will need to produce more food than has ever been produced in human history so far. This would require, by 2050, 120% more water for agriculture, and that's on top of the 70% we already use. So that's an impossibility. Were that to be a possibility, through desalination, for example, this extra production would need to come from 40% more cropland, and it will involve the loss of 14% more forest. The agri-food sector in 2050, if we carry on as we are, will itself create 2 degrees of global warming. That's everything that we signed up to intergovernmentally at Kyoto. So that leaves no space for transport or any other things. And of course, we'll lose much of the world's biodiversity. There is a very large consensus in my community, the biodiversity community. I hope you all like my tie. The biodiversity community, that the world is very much food is the cause of much of the world's biodiversity and the biggest threat. I've just got the 1 minute signal, so I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. This is a map of the global calorie production. Where it is green, people eat it. Where it is red, cows or other livestock eat it. I did an analysis a few months ago which showed that for the American market, where the data is available, and it's different and there are very many reasons why, a family emits more carbon, so has more climate change impact, from the meat it eats rather than the cars it drives. The journalist I ended up talking to about this ended up shouting at me. He was an American, Jeremy Clarkson, so of course he would shout at me. Ended up shouting at me saying, my industry has been under pressure to decarbonise for 30 years. I know if I go out of a room, I have to turn the engine, turn the lights off. I know if I drive, I have to pick a fuel-efficient car, and I know how to drive to make things efficient. I know to buy this rather than this because it's more energy efficient. Why is no one shouting at me that if I eat X, Y, and Z, primarily steak, it's like driving a Range Rover or another SUV? There are a lot of things that we can do about changing our diets in a pro-environmental way. We could eat less meat, we could eat insects, very trendy at the moment, we could eat stem cell burgers, we could eat vegetarian soya, and so on. But the question is, this is a very complex system. We produce food, it impacts on the environment, it goes into a chain that we end up accessing the food, it impacts on our nutrition, health and well-being, which is also impacted by the environment. Who makes the decisions? Supermarkets say they provide food that we want. We say we don't know what the hidden agenda is, we don't know what you're giving us. And government stands back and says, it's all right as long as the market works. Who has the power to change it? Ultimately, it's us. Of course it's us. If we say to supermarkets, we will not buy the food that you give us, we want something else, they would supply it. But just to illustrate this, final-ish slide, this is a map from the Netherlands, so it's all in Dutch. 65,000 farmers, 16.7 million consumers. There are 5 major suppliers in the middle of that, feeding into 25 supermarket chains. The power that's invested in the agri-food industry, especially big agri-food, is huge. So somehow we've got issues to do with influencing. So, conclusions. We can grow more food and reduce its impact. There is no magic bullet. We need to do better in terms of the intensification side, the sustainability side. We need to change diets, we need to change attitudes, we need to change so many different things. So social change is as important, and sometimes us technophiles think it's all about the science, it's all about the widgets, but actually changing people's attitudes and some of those things is possibly more important. But one of the things that I must stress is that we have to do the research. All of these challenges have at their core a fundamental lack of knowledge or how to do things. And one of the most important things that we need to do is protect our science budget at a country basis. I'll just leave this slide up because David's frowning at me again. This is a picture that was produced by the US Food Administration in 1917, 100 years ago. All of these things are more or less still valid today. I just hope, for God's sake, that in 100 years' time, we have moved on from this, and we, collectively, have solved some of these issues. So thank you very much.
Fascinating. Okay, Tim, you sit here. So I'll open the floor, or you can stand up, actually. Open the floor for questions. Now, there'll be a roving mic. Where's Mike? There we are. So if you've got a question, then put your hand up, be very brief, and use the microphone.
And I have a very thick skin. If you want to tell me I've been talking rubbish, please do.
So maybe I'll start things off a bit. It sounds quite simple, really. All we have to do is waste less and eat less. But how does that square up with people that want to make lots of money?
That is the issue. Any ideas from the floor? I mean, I was giving evidence to the Fabian Commission on Food Poverty last week, or the week before. And actually we ended up concluding that solving food poverty meant a complete restructuring of the way we do things in society. So you're exactly right that we can see a way forward in terms of encouraging people to eat differently, eat less, eat better, eat more healthily, but there is a lot of vested interest in more or less the status quo and finding ways to transfer the business of agribusiness into another set of businesses of agribusinesses doing things in a different way without a major perturbation to loosen the shackles of business as usual is really quite difficult to imagine. And one of my colleagues, Professor Tim Lang from City University, who's Professor of Food Policy, is quite pessimistic, and he says, well, actually, I think the solution is going to be some big perturbation, a big climate change event, or some war, or something like that. And in a sense, we looked over the abyss in 2007-8 with the food price spike. Had those food prices gone a little bit further, we would have had to do things quite radically differently. And Tim Lang says the only time we ever really got it right and designed agriculture to provide nutrition and health for the public was in the Second World War. And that's where decisions were taken away from the market and centralised. And so you could imagine some big perturbation doing that, but nobody wants that. I want some rationality in the system, that we see the business opportunities of doing things in a different way and develop alternative business models like you guys are doing.
Question over there.
You advise DFID. Can you say what sort of advice you give them on the best way of developing sustainable agriculture and investing Britain's aid budget?
I advise, but that doesn't mean anyone listens to me. With respect to the aid budget, there is the old way of thinking is very much that agriculture is the engine of the economy, and by helping people to produce more, you enter a virtuous circle that they then have some excess to sell, that they can get some income, and once they've got income, they can invest, and they can invest in education, and things get better and better and better. And that is still largely, even though it's now somewhat hidden behind economic growth per se, is still DFID's way of thinking in terms of how best to spend the money. But there are lots of slips between cup and lip, as they say.
Question there with a lady. Yellow.
I can see Maggie. Maggie ought to answer that one. Maggie's an ex-DFID employee.
Okay, well, there's two
She's
questions
waving her
there.
hands around.
The lady,
Sorry,
Maggie, is it? Or
yes,
the lady
Maggie.
in the back there, and the lady with the yellow top.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm Maggie Gill, and I work for DFID still, 10% of my time.
10%.
And I have recently, we have recently launched a program on sustainable intensification in Africa. And what that program, it's a program of research. I advise the agriculture research team. And what we're actually funding is research which looks at how the enabling environment, which is basically policy and institutions, enables the poor and especially women farmers to be able to participate in this market, in the market opportunities. So we're taking that tack. And but I was going to ask a slightly different question, which was about, you mentioned about the Second World War, and about that's when we got it right. But, you know, in CAP, and there is a lot of evidence that where the subsidies have gone, where the research money's gone, then it has led to some of the less healthy foods that are produced. There is still an underinvestment, I would suggest, in horticulture research, fruit and vegetables. You said at the end we need to know more in research. And there is some evidence, actually, that if you reduce meat in your diet, depending on where you're starting from, and you replace it with other so-called healthy things, you're not necessarily doing the right thing for the environment. So it's not just about knocking cows and saying they just contribute to greenhouse gases. There is a complexity in there, and part of that complexity, I would say, is policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the issue about meat, clearly it's important from livelihoods perspective. Meat production systems around the world, especially in the developing world, pastoral systems are hugely important for livelihoods, for nutrition, for the environment. I would say the issue is just how much meat do we need to produce and how should we produce it. But the transference, the rebound impacts, yes. So and that's partly why we need to do some more research. If we are going to eat less meat, do we end up eating more soya and chopping down rainforest to produce the soya? Do we need more insects, or do we need more root vegetables? And if we wanted a lot more root vegetables, we'd have to do things quite differently in the UK. So there are all sorts of knock-on things. But like if you do things more sustainably, or recycle more, you might save more money because you're not throwing so much food away. Some of that money almost inevitably ends up you taking some foreign holiday and contributing to climate change by having an extra flight. So the rebound effects of what you do when you change behaviour are hugely important, and we haven't thought enough about them. But they're part of the challenge, you know, Maggie.
Okay.
My question relates a little bit to this. You mentioned the intensification in the production of food, and my question is, to what extent should animal welfare be sacrificed to the intensification of its production?
Well, you're perhaps asking the wrong person, as I tend to be vegetarian. I think, I mean, ultimately that's a societal choice. That's not a scientific issue. And I know I was talking to Rosie Boycott, one of the food campaigners down in London, and she was saying she procures for hospitals and things like that. She was saying she could get a chicken breast for 35p from China, or she can get an organic, slow-growing chicken breast for £3.50, and once it's cooked in a curry or something, you can't tell the difference between them. So, you know, in a sense, it's not about the food per se, it's about our attitudes to food. And I certainly remember the first time I went to China, coming out the airport, being overtaken by a lorry that had live pigs in, and they had their legs tied and they were just piled on top of each other, upside down, and all the rest of it. That's perfectly acceptable in China. But I personally don't think. Yes, you're the expert here. Yeah.
I think it would be a real shame. I think there's morals, ethics, and all the rest of it. If we went down a route where anything goes, I really think you might as well just give up. I don't want to go down that route, and I hope that a lot of people in this country won't be like that.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, if the market rules completely and we don't kind of link up these costs, the cost benefits, then that is the way it's going to happen. You're not going to have any choice. Your food will come from the cheapest source. So I don't know how we're going to do this, but we need to link up the cost of health, the cost of the environment, actual real cost for our pockets. Yeah. Anyway, there's another question over there.
Ian Bainbridge from Scottish Natural Heritage. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've heard more and more about domestic food waste, and you referred to it several times, but all of the emphasis and the responsibility is placed on the individual consumer chucking things out of their fridge. How much responsibility is borne by the big supermarket chains in terms of the amount of food that they reject from the farm, which never gets even as far as the processing plant. And is that an issue that we ought to be addressing as well?
It is certainly an issue. I was chairing a meeting the other day on resilience of the food system, and one of the people who was from Wageningen effectively said the most resilient food system, the most resilient supply chain, was one where you were overproduced 200%. Then if something went wrong, you had such a buffer that there would always be food in the shops. So there is an element, well, it's very easy to blame, but in essence, we have got the food system that we have asked for over the decades. We want cheap food that's permanently available. And one of the downsides of that is that there is a lot of insurance production to make sure that if it's a bad year, there is still food on the shelves. If we reject that, that's what I mean. We've got the power in a sense. But yes, there is complicitness in the food system. And I was in my local supermarket a couple of weeks ago, and they had 3-for-1 bags of lettuce. And only when you looked were they to be eaten that day, best before that day. And so you can imagine everybody saying, oh, what a wonderful bargain, taking it home, and then 2 days later throwing it all away. So I think that sort of thing, I would hesitate to say we should regulate against it, given our current non-regulatory approaches. But I think, there is an ethical and moral dimension here that we should be telling the supermarkets is not acceptable to us.
I think, unfortunately, regulation is probably the only way to do it. And there's a question up there.
Thank you very much. I'm an organic farmer across borders, and I'm delighted to be able to give the evidence from our farming that we were conventional farmers going to organic, that actually there's been no reduction in productivity. In fact, we've made the farm more productive. I'm very encouraged by the results of Berkeley University, which demonstrate that organic doesn't necessarily result in a reduction in yields, and likewise recent research on biodiversity. But that, I needed to make that statement because I'm an organic farmer. But my question really is that I'm assuming that the intensification, the sustainable intensification, is predicated on an increased use of fossil fuels and mechanization. If that's the case in the developed world, then how do we square the circle of actually becoming less fossil fuel dependent?
Yeah. It's not predicated upon it, although for the poorest farmers on the poorest soils, by having access to nitrogen fertilizer, it allows enough biomass production that they can then start composting effectively. They've got a byproduct that they can then use to improve soil carbon. So it's not a necessity, but it's often useful because you can't get the carbon and the manure from elsewhere. Yeah, this is an issue. The argument, the logic of sustainable intensification is that we need to improve outputs per unit area, but it's the argument that I espouse is neutral to how you do that. It could be by more intensive knowledge use, it could be by more intensive labour, it could be by more intensive other things without necessarily lots of synthetic inputs. I think as we look ahead, there is the potential for, and you might not like this, synthetic inputs to arise through non-fossil fuel means. So Siemens, for example, has just developed a means of using wind turbines to fix nitrogen as an energy store for when the wind stops. So you put a lot of energy in, you create fixed nitrogen, and then when the wind stops, you can burn the nitrogen back to gas, and hydrogen gas, and that liberates the energy. So nitrogen per se can act as a battery, in a sense. But until oil prices went down, the bottom was falling out of the renewables market. So then they said, oh, what a great idea if we can put this little machine, because it's a ability to generate nitrogen fertilizer in a machine about the size of this table, not these enormous Haber-Bosch processes that require huge amounts of energy. These machines theoretically can go on the back of a tractor and sit in somebody's farmyard. The wind turbine can go round and produce nitrogen fertilizer for free at the point of use from the farmer. So that might be a route to wean us off the fossil fuel side of the nitrogen but it's still a synthetic input, which is not organic in the sense of full of carbon as well.
Okay, we have two more questions. The lady here and the gentleman with the yellow top.
Hi, Professor. I am a student from St. George's School for Girls, and I am not sure if what I am saying is related to the topic today, but I study in the school and I live in a boarding house. The school always provide massive lunch and dinner for us, and I realized that there are many leftover food. And according to the school or maybe the government health and safety law or regulations, we are not allowed to keep the food, and there is a massive amount of food waste. And I thought this food could actually help poverty or can be given to food bank. And do you have any ways or alternatives to make this more sustainable, or to make the food leftover or waste more useful?
Yeah. So you raise a really interesting question, which is not too dissimilar from the welfare question, because in a sense, our food safety regulations are to try and minimise the chance of anyone getting sick from food that's been out of the fridge, especially at the point of sale or production in a non-domestic setting. Now, that's a choice that society has says E. coli and Campylobacter are things that are so bad we should really make sure that no one is at risk, or very few people are at risk. We could change that choice, and we could say, instead of it being a 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 10,000 chance of you getting ill, it could be 1 in 1,000. But that would need societal buy-in to do it. The issue that I think is more germane is not that trade-off between safety and waste. It is what you do with the waste if it is generated. And the fact that our post foot and mouth, we do not allow, and CJD, we do not allow recycling of food back into the food chains of things like pigs, which have always been our scavengers, I think is a science question, a technical question that we should find a way of answering. So we don't just say there's too much of a risk of things going through the food chain. We should find a way of making sure that that food is not really wasted.
Douglas Hall, just a punter who's interested in the subject matter, and I'd like to thank you for a very interesting talk. My question really is, how, in what way can the message the very important message from your research be given a greater voice in this world? Because it seems that to me it challenges some other research projects you were going. You touched on a 30% population growth by the middle of the century. And I'm reminded of a research project by a multimillionaire in America, Peter Thiel, to find a cure for aging, in which he thought did not see any reason why death cannot be eradicated. So one predicts a population growth. And the other strand seems to me, the more we get greenhouse gases, the more we get global warming, the more it brings into question James Lovelock's Gaia theory of eventually the Earth itself turning against us. You raised some very interesting points. How do you get a bigger voice in the overall say of how we develop?
I suspect personally I don't want a bigger voice, but I think the title of my job, for the cross-government job, is Champion for Global Food Security. And there's some interesting politics around that, because if I was the director of the Global Food Security Programme, it would imply I could tell people what to do, which I can't. It took months to work out that way of titling me. I take the term champion very seriously. So I gave a schools talk the other day, and I do quite a lot of public speaking to various audiences. Because for me, the issue is not government imposes, but we learn bottom up that actually we want to live healthily, we want to buy healthily, we want to sustain the planet. Supermarkets help us, or food shops help us to buy the things that will do that. Not sell us things with a green label on because you're going to make a profit, but genuinely help us. And I think if enough of us try and drive that, and each person who's perhaps been stimulated by today's conversations goes off and seeds the germ of the idea amongst your friends and your colleagues and your family, then they're in as the route for productive social change rather than waiting for government to do something or waiting for the supermarkets to do something, because they won't do it until we ask them to, effectively.
Well, I think it's a good place to finish. It's up to us, especially more education, We decide in the end. We know what's good for us, hopefully, and we take notice and not just blindly go ahead and be kind of taken down the wrong route. So, in a traditional way, I would like to invite Professor Monroe to come up, give a vote of thanks on our behalf, to thank Tim for a fascinating talk.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, after that, what do you say, for goodness sake? But really, you know, if I think about what's going to happen next, we'll start thinking about the next Peter Wilson lecture. And at the forefront of our mind in deciding what we're going to do, it's always about what would be the sort of burning issue that Peter would wish to see us discuss. But in addition to that, it's about a topic which is a burning issue of the day. And we certainly have had that. It's a burning issue which has got relevance to both the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Society of Biology, and SCRR, because it encompasses so much of what each of the three societies is all about. The other aspect that we have got to take into consideration each time is that we want a good speaker. And by Jove, have we had that tonight. A speaker who has talked not just with the authority of his own science, but with the authority of a whole diverse range of sciences, indeed into social science, into ethical policy, and a whole range of things, which I think now are becoming increasingly important in terms of addressing any of the issues that faces society at the present moment. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, we heard from David right at the beginning, was instigated to study useful knowledge. And certainly the knowledge which we've all acquired tonight, I hope, will be useful in the future. But the society itself, RSE, spawns its being out of the intellectual ferment that was the enlightenment of Scotland those many years ago. And the essence of that was that we had a whole series of polymaths, people who had knowledge over a wide range of things and were able to address the important issues of the day. And in Tim tonight, we've had someone who is very much in that mould, someone who's addressed a really important issue that faces the whole of society, but done it, pulling it together, a whole variety of different lines of argument which are necessary to address this most complex and really perturbing issue. Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you all to join with me in saying very great thanks to Tim for his wonderful lecture this evening. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that fascinating talk. I've heard Tim speak before, and he hasn't disappointed me tonight either. Fascinating, very good. So it just leaves me to remind you all there's plenty of talks and meetings over the future. So I encourage you to look at the various websites of the Society of Biology and the Royal Society, and just speak to some of the people out to the front there, and they might help you in the future. So let's close the meeting and wish you all a safe journey home. Thank you.